Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. The cherry blossoms had always marked the beginning of spring in Willowbrook. For as long as Evelyn could remember, the trees would erupt into a sea of soft pink petals, drawing visitors from all over to admire their beauty. The annual Blossom Festival was the highlight of the season, a tradition spanning over a century. Vendors lined the streets with stalls selling flower-themed pastries, lanterns swayed in the evening breeze, and the air carried the scent of warm cinnamon and jasmine. It was supposed to be a time of joy, but this year the town felt different. The blossoms smelled wrong. Evelyn couldn't explain it. She had been attending the festival her entire life, first as a child gripping her mother's hand, then as a teenager sneaking off with friends. Now, as a journalist for the local paper, she had a reason to be there every year. And yet, as she walked through the crowds taking photos for her article, a nagging sense of unease settled in her stomach. She first heard the whisper as she stood beneath the largest tree in the orchard, adjusting her camera lens. "Help us!" The voice was barely there, just a breath carried by the wind. She spun around, heart pounding, scanning the festival goers. No one else reacted. Laughter and music carried on as if nothing had happened. Evelyn shook her head. "I'm imagining things." But the unease didn't fade. That night, as she uploaded her photos, she noticed something strange. In one of her shots, an image of the cherry orchard, bathed in golden festival lights, there were faces among the branches. Not full figures, just pale, stretched faces, mouths open in silent screams. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She zoomed in. The details sharpened, the contours of cheekbones, the emptiness of hollow eyes. But it made no sense. She had been alone when she took that picture. A sudden rustling sound broke the silence in her apartment. Evelyn's breath caught as she turned sharply toward the window. The curtains swayed, but the glass was shut tight. Outside, the cherry trees stood still in the moonlight. And then the whisper came again. "Help us." This time it was closer. She grabbed her phone, debating whether to call someone. Who? The police? What could she possibly say? "Excuse me, officer, the cherry trees are talking to me?" No one would believe her. Evelyn took a deep breath. Maybe she was just overtired. Too much caffeine, too many late nights working on stories. She needed sleep, but as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The cherry blossoms had always marked the arrival of spring in Willowbrook. This year, they marked the beginning of something else. Something hungry. Evelyn barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the whisper returned. "Help us." The words crawled beneath her skin, twisting through her thoughts like roots searching for cracks. Each time she drifted off, she saw flashes of pale faces woven between the cherry blossoms, their hollow mouths stretching into silent screams. By morning, exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. But as she sat at her desk, staring at the photo on her laptop, a new, more chilling realization set in. The faces weren't just random shapes in the trees. They were the faces of the missing. Evelyn's stomach twisted. The festival had always been a time of celebration, but people had disappeared during it before. It was nothing official, just whispered town gossip, stories that faded after a week or two. A child who had wandered too far into the orchard and never returned. A tourist who had been last seen beneath the blossoms. No bodies, no explanations, just vanished. And no one ever talked about them after they were gone. Evelyn leaned forward, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. She pulled up old town records, searching for missing person reports filed during past festivals. It didn't take long for the pattern to emerge. Every 30 to 40 years, someone vanished without a trace. Her breath caught in her throat as she scrolled through the names. The most recent was from 36 years ago. A 12-year-old girl. Last seen in the orchard. Case closed due to lack of evidence. Before that, a woman in her 20s. Before that, a young boy. And the further back she looked, the harder it was to find information. As if the town had been erasing them. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Had the town known? Had they let it happen? Determined to get answers, she grabbed her jacket and drove straight to the one person who might talk. The oldest resident of Willowbrook, Mr. Whitaker. His house was perched on the outskirts of town, a relic from another era. Paint peeled from the wooden siding, and the porch creaked beneath Evelyn's weight as she knocked. The door opened slower than she expected, revealing a frail man with clouded eyes that still held too much awareness. "You shouldn't be asking about that," he said before she even spoke. Evelyn stiffened. "You know what I'm here for." Whitaker's gaze drifted toward the orchard in the distance. The trees were in full bloom, their petals carried through the air like falling snow. His hands trembled as he gripped the doorframe. "They always come back," he muttered. "Every spring they try to take another." Evelyn's breath hitched. Who are they?" Whitaker's gaze finally met hers, and the weight in his eyes sent a shiver through her. "The ones who were never laid to rest." A gust of wind stirred the branches in the distance. For a moment, Evelyn swore she heard it again. "Help us." And this time, she wasn't the only one who heard it. Whitaker flinched, his grip tightening on the doorframe. "You need to leave this alone." Evelyn shook her head. "I can't. People are missing. If there's something going on, I need to expose it." The old man sighed, his frail shoulders sinking. "You don't understand. This town, it's cursed. The festival, the blossoms, they feed it." Evelyn frowned. "Feed what?" Whitaker's voice was barely above a whisper. "The roots." A chill crawled up Evelyn's spine. "You mean the trees?" "The trees," he said. "And what's buried beneath them." That night, Evelyn returned to the orchard. The festival had ended, and the lanterns had been taken down, leaving the trees bathed in eerie moonlight. The air was still, too still. She stepped cautiously between the trunks, her footsteps muffled by fallen petals. She pulled out her phone, using the light to scan the ground. The earth here felt soft, too soft for a place that had remained undisturbed for decades. Then she saw it, a section of the soil where the petals had turned black. She crouched, brushing them aside, and her fingers met something cold. Bone! Her stomach twisted. She dug deeper, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then, a jawbone emerged from the soil, grinning up at her through the roots of the cherry trees. She barely had time to scream before the ground shifted beneath her, and something pulled her under. Evelyn gasped as the ground beneath her collapsed, dragging her into the darkness. She twisted, her hands grasping at loose soil and tangled roots, but there was nothing to stop her descent. A second later, she landed hard on her back, the air rushing from her lungs as dust filled her mouth. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, suffocating, and absolute. Then, something shifted in the darkness. A dry rasp like the wind through dead leaves. She scrambled for her phone, the light flickering as she held it up. The space around her was a cavern of tangled roots and bones. Dozens, maybe hundreds, protruding from the earth like grotesque decorations. The walls were damp, the air thick with the stench of rot and something metallic. She wasn't alone. The whisper came again. "Help us." Evelyn's breath hitched as she swung her phone toward the sound. And then she saw them. Figures, barely visible, pressed against the roots like shadows fused with the earth. Their hollow eyes followed her, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. They were trapped. She stumbled back, her foot hitting something solid. She looked down. A skull, half buried in the soil, its empty sockets locked onto hers. Panic surged through her as she clawed at the dirt walls, trying to find a way out. The roots twisted under her fingers like they were alive, tightening their grip on the bones beneath. Then movement. The shadows in the walls shifted. One figure peeled itself from the roots, its skeletal frame jerking unnaturally as it stepped forward. Evelyn's chest clenched as more followed, their mouths forming soundless words. And then finally she understood. They weren't calling for help. They were warning her. A gust of wind howled through the cavern, and Evelyn barely had time to brace herself before something lunged from the darkness. It wasn't like the others. This thing was alive. Its form was twisted, human-shaped but wrong. The cherry blossoms were growing from its skin, its body fused with the roots. Long, gnarled fingers reached for her, its mouth opening in a scream that finally broke through the silence. Evelyn ran. She bolted through the cavern, stumbling over bones, clawing at the dirt walls. The thing behind her followed, its breath like rustling leaves, its limbs creaking as it moved. The passage narrowed, roots clawing at her ankles. She could see a sliver of moonlight above. Summoning every ounce of strength, she threw herself upward, her hands grasping at the edge of the hole. The creature's fingers brushed her shoe, but she kicked hard, breaking free. Then she was back in the orchard, gasping for air, the scent of cherry blossoms choking her lungs. But the ground below her was solid again. The hole was gone. She scrambled back, dirt-streaked and shaking. The orchard was silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But Evelyn knew the truth now. The festival wasn't just a celebration. It was a sacrifice. And she had just witnessed what happened to those who were taken. Evelyn sat in her apartment, the scent of dirt and cherry blossoms still clinging to her clothes. No matter how many times she washed her hands, the feeling of something gripping her ankle lingered. She hadn't stopped shaking since she pulled herself out of that pit. She knew what she had seen, bones, shadows, something alive beneath the roots. But how could she possibly explain it to anyone? Her laptop screen glowed in the dim room, displaying the records she had found the day before. Missing persons reports. Every 30 to 40 years, someone disappeared. But no one remembered. No one talked about it, because they were never meant to come back. A deep unease settled in her gut. Had the town known all along? Had they allowed it to happen? She grabbed her phone and dialed Mr. Whitaker's number. It rang twice before he answered, his voice tight. "You shouldn't have gone back," he said before she could even speak. "I saw them," Evelyn whispered. "The ones who are buried beneath the trees." A long silence stretched between them. Then Whitaker exhaled. "You need to leave, Evelyn. You don't understand what you've uncovered." Her grip tightened on the phone. "Then tell me." Another pause. Then, in a voice laced with something close to regret, he said, "Meet me at the old chapel." Midnight. The line went dead. The old chapel sat at the far end of Willowbrook, past the residential streets, where the trees grew wild and untouched by the festival's beauty. Evelyn parked her car beneath an overgrown willow and stepped into the night. The air was thick, heavy, and carried a damp scent of earth that had been disturbed. Whitaker was waiting by the broken iron gate, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Without a word, he turned and walked inside. Evelyn followed, her pulse quickening. The chapel smelled of mildew and age, dust swirling in the dim light from the lantern he carried. "This town," he started, voice hushed. "It was built on a debt." Evelyn frowned. "A debt?" Whitaker nodded. "A long time ago, before the first settlers came, this land belonged to another people. They worshipped the roots, the earth itself. And when they were forced out, they left behind something, hungry." A shiver ran through her. "The trees." He nodded. "The cherry blossoms were never meant to be planted here. But when the town started losing crops, suffering droughts, the elders made a deal. Every 36 years, a life would be taken." Evelyn's breath hitched. "A sacrifice." Whitaker looked at her, his eyes dark. "In exchange, Willowbrook thrived. The festival, the town's prosperity, it's all because of them." Evelyn felt nausea twist in her stomach. "And the town just lets it happen?" His jaw tightened. "Not everyone remembers. The festival keeps people distracted, keeps them from looking too closely. But those who do know," he sighed, "they say nothing, because if the sacrifice isn't made, the trees take more." The realization hit her like a blow. The missing children, the tourists, they weren't just accidents. They were taken because the town let them be. Evelyn shook her head, horror creeping through her bones. "We have to stop it." Whitaker's gaze was heavy. "It's been tried before. Every time it failed. And those who tried," he gestured to the floorboards beneath them, "they became part of the debt." A creak echoed through the chapel. The wind outside shifted, carrying the scent of blossoms and decay. Evelyn turned toward the doorway. The cherry trees outside were moving. Branches swayed, though there was no breeze. The air felt heavier, thick with something unseen, something watching. The lantern in Whitaker's hands flickered. Then came the sound, rustling, like dry leaves scraping against each other, but deeper, closer. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears. "What is that?" Whitaker's face had gone pale. He took a step back, his voice barely a whisper. "It's too soon. They shouldn't be waking yet." A low groan echoed through the chapel walls, as if the wood itself were breathing. Evelyn backed up, gripping the pew behind her. The floor beneath her feet shifted, softening like loose earth. Something moved outside. Through the stained glass window, she saw them. figures among the trees, barely distinguishable from the gnarled branches. Not just one, not just two, dozens. Watching, waiting. A sharp crack splintered the silence. The old wooden door burst open. A gust of wind flooded the chapel, carrying the scent of decay and blossoms. Evelyn stumbled, shielding her eyes from the swirling petals. When she looked back up, the figures were closer. And this time they were moving toward her. Whitaker grabbed her arm. "Run!" But before she could move, something cold and sharp curled around her ankle. The roots had found her. Evelyn gasped as something tightened around her ankle. Cold, rough, like fingers made of bark, the roots coiled with unnatural force. She struggled, kicking against them, but they wouldn't loosen. The chapel around her groaned, the air thick with the scent of decay and blossoms. Whitaker yanked her arm, trying to pull her free, but the roots pulled back. The wooden floor beneath her splintered, breaking apart into the soft, hungry earth below. Evelyn let out a sharp cry as she felt herself sinking. "They're trying to take you," Whitaker shouted, panic lacing his voice. Evelyn clawed at the floorboards, her fingers scraping against the aged wood. The figures outside were closer now, standing just beyond the shattered doorway. Their bodies were elongated, their faces twisted into hollow expressions, as if frozen in eternal agony. She met their eyes, if they even had eyes, and suddenly, the whispers in the air became screams. "Help us! They won't let us go!" The voices came from everywhere, surrounding her, inside her head, ringing between the chapel's decaying walls. Whitaker dug his heels into the ground, holding onto her with all his strength. "Fight it, damn it!" Evelyn twisted her body, trying to wrench her leg free, but the roots only tightened. She could feel them pulsing, like veins filled with something alive. Desperation surged through her. She reached for the lantern that Whitaker had dropped, still flickering on the ground. With a last frantic effort, she smashed it against the roots, sending flames licking across the tangled mass. A horrific, inhuman shriek tore through the air. The roots recoiled, loosening just enough for Evelyn to yank herself free. She scrambled backward, gasping for breath, as the fire spread. Whitaker pulled her up. "Move!" They ran. Through the doorway, past the looming figures that did nothing to stop them. The trees trembled violently, as if something deep beneath them was writhing in pain. The roots in the ground lashed out, trying to grasp at their feet, but they didn't stop running. Whitaker shoved her toward the car. "Drive!" Evelyn barely registered throwing herself into the driver's seat, hands shaking as she turned the key. The engine roared to life. Whitaker barely managed to slam the passenger door shut before she hit the gas, tires spitting dirt as they tore away from the chapel. The town of Willowbrook lay ahead, but as she glanced in the rearview mirror, her stomach dropped. The cherry blossoms were dying. The once vibrant pink petals were blackening, curling in on themselves. The trees seemed to wither, their branches drooping as though whatever force had sustained them was being burned away. For a moment, Evelyn thought they had won, that the fire had been enough. Then she saw it. In the distance, beyond the chapel, something was rising from the earth. It was huge, its form obscured by darkness, but its eyes, glowing hollow sockets of light, were locked onto them. Evelyn's hands clenched the wheel. This isn't over. Evelyn's hands were still trembling as she gripped the steering wheel, the car speeding away from the dying orchard. The blackened petals swirled in the air like ashes from a fire, coating the road behind them. Whitaker sat beside her, his face pale, his breath coming in uneven gasps. "Where do we go now?" Evelyn asked, her voice unsteady. Whitaker hesitated before answering. "The town records. If we want to stop this, we need to know exactly what deal was made, and how to break it." Evelyn swallowed hard. "You said people have tried before. They failed." She tightened her grip on the wheel. "Then we'll have to find a way they didn't." The town hall was eerily silent when they arrived. It was late, but the security lights cast long shadows along the walls, making the building seem even more ominous. Evelyn pushed open the heavy doors, the scent of aged paper and dust filling her nose. Whitaker led her through the corridors toward the archive room. He produced a rusted key from his pocket and slid it into the lock. "No one ever comes down here anymore," he muttered. "Not since the last incident." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "What incident?" He didn't answer. The door creaked open, revealing rows upon rows of ancient records, bound in cracked leather and yellowed paper. The walls felt like they were pressing in as she stepped inside. Whitaker moved with purpose, pulling out a heavy ledger from the 1800s. "This is where it started," he murmured, flipping through the brittle pages. "The original settlers. They arrived during the worst drought in history. The crops failed, the livestock died, and people started starving." Evelyn peered over his shoulder. The ink had faded, but she could make out a contract scrawled across the page. "The land provided them a way to survive," Whitaker continued, his voice tight. "But it demanded something in return." Evelyn scanned the text. The words were old, almost unreadable, but the meaning was clear. One life for every 36 years. A shudder ran through her. "And they agreed to this?" Whitaker nodded grimly. "They thought they could control it, choose who would be taken. But the land was never under their control." The ink darkened at the bottom of the page. Evelyn squinted, and then her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't ink. It was blood. A sudden gust of wind swept through the archive room, extinguishing the overhead light. The air turned cold, the scent of cherry blossoms twisting into something rotten. Whitaker slammed the book shut. "They know we're here." Evelyn turned toward the doorway. The corridor was no longer empty. Shadowed figures stood in the distance, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She took a step back. "Are those the ones who weren't chosen?" Whitaker finished grimly. "The ones who fought back." The figures moved, their forms flickering like shadows caught between two worlds. The whispers began again, louder this time. "Help us! Help us! Help us!" Evelyn's heart pounded. "What do they want?" Whitaker grabbed her arm. "They want to finish what was started." A sharp crack echoed through the building. The floor shuddered beneath them, deep fissures forming between the tiles. Then, from beneath the cracks, the roots began to emerge. The town was waking up, and it was hungry. The roots surged from the ground like grasping fingers, splintering the floor of the archive room. Evelyn barely had time to react before Whitaker yanked her backward, shoving her against the shelves as the first set of twisting, blackened vines lashed through the air where she had just stood. A deafening crack echoed through the building as wood and stone gave way beneath the force of something ancient waking beneath Willowbrook. "Move!" Whitaker shouted, grabbing Evelyn's arm and pulling her away from the growing chaos. They ran, weaving through the narrow corridors as the roots followed, writhing and slithering like serpents through the floor and walls. The walls trembled, the ancient bookshelves groaning before crashing down, spewing dust and paper into the air. The entire archive was collapsing around them. Evelyn sprinted behind Whitaker, her lungs burning, her mind screaming at her to wake up from this nightmare. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the whispers told her otherwise. "Help us! Help us! Help us!" The voices surrounded her, some urgent, others mournful, but all of them pleading. As she turned the corner, she caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. A shape tall and grotesque, its limbs impossibly long, its face lost in the shifting blossoms that grew from its skull. The creature moved toward them, slow but purposeful, its roots dragging behind it, fusing with the ones ripping through the floor. "We're trapped," Evelyn gasped, searching for an escape route as Whitaker tried to push open the heavy steel doors at the end of the hall. "They sealed it," Whitaker growled, slamming his shoulder against the door, but it refused to budge. Another shudder ran through the building, this time stronger. A section of the ceiling cracked open, revealing a tangle of roots slithering downward like monstrous veins. The air became thick, humid, carrying the stench of decay and soil soaked in centuries of death. Evelyn turned wildly, searching for another exit. There! A small service hatch in the far corner, half hidden behind a collapsed bookcase. "There's a way out," she shouted, scrambling toward it. Whitaker didn't hesitate. Together, they heaved the rusted panel open, revealing a narrow tunnel. A sickeningly sweet scent, cherry blossoms rotting in the dark, hit them as they crawled inside. Evelyn barely fit through the cramped tunnel, her fingers sinking into the damp, earthen walls as she pulled herself forward. Whitaker followed close behind, grunting as he dragged himself through. Then the whispers changed. "Don't leave us! Don't leave us! Don't leave us!" The voice was closer this time, inside the tunnel with them. A cold breath of air rushed past Evelyn's neck, and she bit back a scream. Something brushed against her leg, not roots. Fingers! She kicked out violently, her heart hammering as she scrambled forward. The exit was ahead, She could see the faint glow of moonlight filtering in through the grating at the end. She shoved it open, tumbling onto damp grass, free at last from the suffocating tunnel. Whitaker followed, his face pale and drenched in sweat. He slammed the grate shut behind them, panting. That, he wheezed, was too damn close. Evelyn sat up, her body aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She turned her head, staring back at the town of Willowbrook. But Willowbrook was no longer the same. The cherry trees were moving. They swayed, not with the wind, but with purpose. The streets were empty, yet the distant hum of something alive echoed through the night. The air pulsed with energy, as if the entire town had begun breathing in sync with the thing beneath it. Evelyn swallowed hard. "It's awake, isn't it?" Whitaker nodded grimly. "And it knows we tried to stop it." A chill ran down her spine as the scent of blossoms thickened in the air, mingling with the undeniable scent of rotting flesh. The town wasn't just cursed. It was becoming something else. Something hungry. Something that had already decided who its next sacrifice would be. And it wasn't done with them yet. Evelyn and Whitaker stood frozen, watching the town shift before their eyes. The cherry trees lining the streets were moving, their branches stretching unnaturally, as if reaching for something unseen. The petals, once a soft pink, had darkened, turning a sickly shade of red as they fluttered to the ground like falling embers. The scent of blossoms, once sweet, had rotted into something sour and cloying, mixing with the undeniable stench of decay. The town breathed. It was alive. The streetlights flickered, casting erratic shadows that twisted across the buildings. A deep rumbling echoed beneath their feet, like the heartbeat of something ancient stirring beneath the pavement. Evelyn clenched her fists, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. "We need to get out of here." Whitaker didn't move. His gaze was locked on the town center, where the festival grounds had been just hours before. But the festival was gone. Instead, a massive chasm had opened where the main square once stood. The ground had split apart, revealing something pulsing beneath it. A network of roots so thick they looked like veins. And between those roots, something moved. Evelyn grabbed Whitaker's arm. "Whitaker, we can't stay here." But Whitaker's face had gone pale. His eyes were fixed on the town hall at the far end of the street. The once pristine building was crumbling, its walls covered in twisting vines that pulsed like they had a heartbeat of their own. And standing in front of it, watching them, was a figure draped in shadows. Evelyn felt her stomach turn to ice. She couldn't make out its face, only the outline of its elongated form, its arms stretched impossibly long, its fingers curling like the tips of roots searching for something to consume. Then it moved, not with footsteps but with shifts in the air, as if it wasn't walking but being pulled forward by the roots beneath it. Evelyn took a step back. "We need to." The figure's head snapped toward her. The whispers returned, but they weren't soft this time. They were deafening. "Join us! Join us! Join us!" Evelyn's vision blurred. Her head pounded with the weight of 1,000 voices speaking at once. Her knees buckled, her hands flying to her ears, but the voices didn't stop. Whitaker grabbed her, shaking her violently. "Evelyn, don't listen!" She gasped, blinking rapidly as the voices faded just enough for her to breathe again. But her body was still trembling, her skin itching like something was crawling beneath it. Whitaker hauled her to her feet. The town isn't just waking up, it's becoming part of it. Evelyn didn't need convincing. They ran. The streets were empty, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt like the town was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The buildings, now covered in vines, seemed to lean closer, as if the town itself was closing in. Evelyn's thoughts raced. The records said the town made a deal. A sacrifice every 36 years. If we break the cycle, then we break the town, Whitaker finished grimly. Evelyn swallowed hard. Then we have to find out how. They reached Whitaker's truck and barely slammed the doors shut before something screeched from behind them. Evelyn looked in the rearview mirror and felt her blood turn to ice. The figure was closer. It no longer had a shadowed face. Now its features were shifting, morphing, pulling from familiar faces, faces Evelyn had seen in the records. The missing, the sacrificed. They were part of it now. And soon, if they didn't find a way to stop it, she and Whitaker would be too. Evelyn turned the key. The engine roared to life, but so did something else. The town let out a sound, a groan of shifting earth, a breath of something ancient and patient and waiting. As they sped away, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't running away. They were being herded, and whatever had been sleeping beneath Willowbrook was finally awake. And it was hungry. The truck rumbled down the winding roads of Willowbrook, the scent of burning cherry blossoms thick in the air. Evelyn's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, but she didn't dare slow down. The town behind them was changing, its buildings sinking into the earth, the roots beneath it pulling everything back into the soil. Whitaker sat beside her, clutching the old ledger he had stolen from the archives, his breath shallow. There has to be something in here. Something that tells us how to stop this. Evelyn's mind raced as she kept her eyes on the road, the town's twisted silhouette disappearing in the rearview mirror. The deal was made centuries ago. The land demanded a life every 36 years, and the town obeyed. If we stop the sacrifice. The land takes more, Whitaker finished grimly. But this is different. It's not waiting for a sacrifice anymore. Evelyn swallowed hard. Because we interrupted it. A sharp snap echoed through the trees, and suddenly, the truck lurched to the side. Evelyn fought to keep control, but the tires skidded against the loose gravel, the wheel pulling violently in her hands. Something was underneath them. The truck jerked again, this time harder, and then it stopped. Dead silence. Evelyn's breathing was ragged as she exchanged a glance with Whitaker. He reached for the door handle, but before he could open it, a low groan rumbled beneath them. The roots were here. Slowly, Evelyn turned to look out the windshield. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the road was gone. In its place, the earth had cracked open, and from the darkness below, something moved. A shape, tall, twisted, hollow, rose from the pit, its body nothing but the tangled mass of cherry tree roots woven together. Its face, if it had one, was shifting, morphing between familiar faces. The missing, the sacrificed. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out, only the whispers. Louder than ever. Join us! Join us! Join us! Whitaker's voice was tight with fear. It's them! Evelyn felt a cold, creeping dread settle over her as the thing stepped forward. The trees lining the road began to bend toward it, their branches curling, reaching. The very town itself was being pulled into it, consumed by whatever lay beneath Willowbrook. We have to move, she whispered. Now! Whitaker grabbed the ledger and shoved open the door. The moment his foot touched the ground, the roots lunged. He barely had time to react before they wrapped around his ankle and dragged him toward the pit. No! Evelyn leaped after him, grabbing his arm, pulling with everything she had. The roots tightened, yanking him downward. His fingers dug into the dirt, panic flashing in his eyes. Don't let go! The whispers screamed. Evelyn's vision blurred. Her entire body burned as she fought against the impossible force pulling Whitaker under. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. The ledger. It had fallen open beside her, its brittle pages flipping wildly in the wind. And then she saw it, the last page. A name. A single name, written in old, darkened ink. The name of the next sacrifice. Evelyn's stomach twisted as she read it. It wasn't some random name from the town. It wasn't a stranger. It was hers. The earth shook. The roots lashed out again, pulling Whitaker closer to the edge. She had a choice. She could let Whitaker go and run, or she could do what the town had always done, give the land what it wanted, and save herself. Evelyn's hands trembled as she made her decision. And then she let go. Whitaker's scream was swallowed by the howling wind as he was dragged into the abyss. His fingers, once tightly gripping Evelyn's wrist, slipped free, and his body was pulled downward, into the writhing roots, into the pulsing, living earth beneath Willowbrook. The whispers changed, no longer pleading, but satisfied. The sacrifice has been made. Evelyn stumbled backward, gasping for air, her body shaking violently. Her mind reeled at what she had done, at what she had allowed. The town had demanded a life, and she had given it. It should have been hers, but instead it had taken him. And the town was pleased. The roots that had torn through the streets began to retract, slithering back into the cracked pavement. The twisted cherry trees, their blackened petals still clinging to their gnarled branches, stilled as though a deep breath had been exhaled. The monstrous shape looming over the pit began to sink, vanishing into the earth like a nightmare retreating into darkness. Willowbrook was quiet again, but Evelyn wasn't. Her hands trembled violently as she turned away from the pit. Whitaker was gone. The town was still standing. The cycle had been reset. She had followed the rules. She had obeyed, and she hated herself for it. She drove in silence. The road out of Willowbrook was no longer shifting beneath her tires, no longer leading her in circles. The town had released her, because it had gotten what it wanted. The sun was beginning to rise when Evelyn reached the outskirts of town. She pulled over at an old gas station, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white. She barely noticed the attendant staring at her through the window as she sat there, shaking. What was she supposed to do now? Pretend this had never happened? Pretend she hadn't just handed over a man's life to a town that fed on blood? She reached into the passenger seat, her fingers brushing against the ledger. The book that had revealed everything. The book that had sealed Whitaker's fate. She should burn it, destroy it. But some part of her, the part that knew the truth could never die, couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she opened it. The pages were no longer filled with the names of past sacrifices. The ink had faded, as if the town had erased its past, wiping away the deaths it had claimed. But there was one thing left. One single name. Evelyn Carter. Her name, written in fresh ink. Her breath caught in her throat. The town had let her go. But that didn't mean she was free. The cycle had been reset. And in 36 years it would come for her again. She closed the book, her hands steady now. She had time. Time to find a way to stop it. Time to make sure no one else suffered the way Whitaker had. Time to break the cycle for good. Because if she didn't, next time, there would be no one left to save her. Evelyn sat in the driver's seat, the weight of the ledger heavy in her lap. The ink on the page gleamed under the pale morning light, her name standing stark against the aged parchment. The town had erased its past, but it hadn't erased her. 36 years. That was how long she had until Willowbrook came for her again. Until the cycle repeated itself. But she wasn't going to wait. She wasn't going to let it happen. She started the engine, the old truck groaning as she pulled onto the open road. The town disappeared in the rearview mirror, its twisted trees standing eerily still. The further she drove, the lighter the air felt, as if she had escaped a prison without walls. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. Her first stop was a motel just outside the county line. It was a rundown place with flickering neon lights and a lobby that smelled like stale coffee. The woman at the front desk barely glanced at her as she handed over the key. Room 16. Inside, Evelyn locked the door, bolted the windows, and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion sinking into her bones. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Whitaker's face, his panic, the way his fingers had slipped from hers, the way the roots swallowed him whole. She had let him go, and the town had let her live. The guilt gnawed at her, but guilt wouldn't bring him back. Action would. She sat up, grabbing the ledger from the nightstand. If Willowbrook's curse had started centuries ago, then somewhere, somehow, there had to be a way to end it. By the time the sun set, Evelyn was at a library in the next town over, surrounded by stacks of books, old records, and faded maps. The history of Willowbrook was deeply buried, just like its victims. But she had spent her life digging up stories people wanted forgotten, and this story wasn't going to die with her. She traced her fingers over an old map, her breath catching as she noticed something, a name that no longer existed. A place that had been wiped from all modern maps. The founding settlement. Before Willowbrook, there had been something else. Another town. Another sacrifice. Her pulse quickened. If she could find it, maybe she could find the truth. The key to stopping the cycle. She slammed the book shut, grabbed her keys, and walked out into the cool night air. The wind carried the faint scent of cherry blossoms. She stiffened. There were no cherry trees here. Her eyes darted across the parking lot. It was empty, but something felt wrong. She turned toward her truck, and her breath hitched. On the windshield, resting gently against the glass, was a single perfect cherry blossom. The whispers returned. "We are not done with you." Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. Willowbrook wasn't waiting 36 years. It was coming for her now. Evelyn's hands trembled as she plucked the cherry blossom from the windshield. It was soft, delicate, completely out of place in a town that had no cherry trees. The petals felt too warm, as if they were pulsing with something alive. She let it fall to the ground, backing away toward her truck. She had to leave. Now. The whispering began again, slithering through the cold night air. "We are not done with you." Evelyn threw open the driver's side door and climbed in, locking it behind her. She turned the key in the ignition, but the engine didn't roar to life. Instead, the radio crackled on its own, static filling the cabin. Her breath caught in her throat as a distorted voice hissed through the speakers. "You took what was ours. We will take you instead." The truck lurched forward on its own, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Evelyn gripped the wheel, but it wouldn't turn. She wasn't driving anymore. Panic clawed at her chest as the headlights illuminated something up ahead. The road had changed. It no longer led away from town. Instead, it curved sharply back toward Willowbrook. "No, no, no!" Evelyn slammed her foot on the brake, but the truck didn't stop. It accelerated, the trees on either side of the road blurring into streaks of black. The scent of cherry blossoms grew stronger, suffocating, as if the air itself was thick with it. The road narrowed. The streetlights flickered. And then, the truck slammed to a stop. The force sent Evelyn hurtling forward, her seatbelt cutting into her ribs. She gasped, blinking through the daze, her hands still clutching the wheel. The static on the radio faded, and the whispering stopped. She turned her head slowly, her stomach sinking. She was back in Willowbrook's main square. The town was waiting for her. The streets were empty, but the air hummed with something unseen, something ancient. The buildings, once normal, now looked warped, covered in twisting roots and vines, their windows like gaping mouths watching. Evelyn's breathing grew ragged. She turned off the engine, willing herself to think. She had read the history. She knew the cycle. The town couldn't exist without the sacrifice. If she didn't stop it, it would come for her. Or worse, it would find someone else. She reached for the ledger lying in the passenger seat, flipping through the brittle pages. The name at the bottom, the name that had appeared in fresh ink, hers. Her fingers curled into fists. "No," she whispered. "I won't be next." A low creak echoed through the air. She looked up. At the far end of the square, standing beneath the towering cherry tree in the center, was a figure. Tall, motionless, waiting. The whispers returned. This time they weren't pleading. They were hungry. Evelyn clenched her jaw, gripping the book tighter. If she wanted to survive, she had to break the curse. Tonight, before the town decided to take her anyway. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears as she stepped out of the truck. The air was thick, the scent of cherry blossoms cloying, oppressive. The figure beneath the massive tree stood utterly still, its form almost blending into the shadows of the twisted branches above. The whispering grew louder, circling around her, pressing against her skull like invisible hands. "You were chosen. You must take your place." Her grip tightened on the ledger. This was it. If she didn't act now, she would disappear like the others, just another name lost to history, swallowed by the roots. She forced herself forward, step by step, until she stood just a few feet from the figure. The tree's massive trunk was cracked open at its base, revealing a gaping hollow, dark as a pit leading straight to the center of the earth. The air around it shimmered, vibrating with unnatural energy. "You don't control me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The figure moved at last, shifting slightly, as if reacting to her words. Then it lifted its head. Evelyn gasped. It wasn't a stranger. It was Whitaker. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, but it was him. Or what was left of him. His body was entangled with roots, his skin almost fused with the tree, like he had been growing into it, becoming part of it. Her breath caught in her throat. "No, no, that's not possible." His lips moved, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was the town's voice, layered with countless others, old and young, male and female. A chorus of the lost. The cycle cannot be broken. Evelyn clenched her fists. "I don't believe that." The whispers screeched, the sound like wind howling through dead branches. The roots at Whitaker's feet lurched forward, reaching for her, but she stepped back just in time. Her eyes darted to the ledger. The names, the history. The contract was written in blood, and blood was the only way to undo it. Heart hammering, she flipped through the pages until she found the first name, the original sacrifice. The person who had made the deal in the first place. Jonas Caldwell, the town's founder. Evelyn's mind raced. The town didn't just demand blood, it demanded his bloodline. Every name on this list was a descendant of that man. That's why it had chosen Whitaker. That's why it had chosen her. Because she was one too. The realization struck her like a punch to the gut. She had spent her life exposing the truth, digging up history that wasn't meant to be found. And somehow, she had never known the truth about herself. That's why the town called her back. Her hands trembled as she reached into her pocket, pulling out the small hunting knife she had taken from Whitaker's truck. The roots quivered as she held it up, the silver blade gleaming in the moonlight. If blood sealed the deal, maybe blood could break it. She took a slow, shuddering breath, then slashed the blade across her palm. The effect was immediate. The whispering turned to screaming. The tree shook violently, its branches flailing as if caught in a storm. The roots recoiled, writhing like injured snakes, and Whitaker's form twisted, his hollow eyes finally showing something besides emptiness. Pain! Evelyn stepped closer, holding her bleeding hand out toward the gaping hollow in the tree. The town wanted blood? Fine, but it would take all of it. She slammed her bloodied palm against the bark. The ground erupted. A shockwave pulsed outward, knocking her off her feet. The entire town groaned, buildings rattling, the air shimmering with energy as something broke. The sky above split open, revealing a swirling darkness that swallowed the moon. The cycle was ending, and Willowbrook was dying with it. The ground beneath Evelyn trembled violently as the force of her blood offering shattered the ancient pact. The sky above twisted unnaturally, the moon swallowed by an abyss of swirling darkness. A deafening crack echoed through the night, and the great cherry tree at the heart of Willowbrook began to split. Whitaker's twisted form convulsed, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the roots that bound him to the tree recoiled. He wasn't the only one. All around the square, shadows began to rise from the earth. Spectral figures of those who had been taken, their bodies frozen in expressions of agony and loss. The whispering voices turned to wails, 1,000 tormented souls finally breaking free from their prison beneath the town. Evelyn struggled to her feet, her bleeding palm throbbing. The energy in the air felt like it was pressing against her ribs, suffocating her, forcing her to witness the unraveling of Willowbrook. This is what they kept hidden. The sacrifices had never been taken to sustain the town. They had been taken to contain what lived beneath it. The founders had made their pact in blood, not just for prosperity, but to seal something away. And now it was loose. The cherry trees along the main square blackened, their blossoms curling inward as if burning from the inside out. The ground cracked wider, revealing a network of tunnels lined with writhing, pulsing roots, dripping with something thick and dark. And from the deepest part of the earth, something stirred. A sound unlike anything Evelyn had ever heard rumbled through the square. It was low, guttural, filled with something ancient and hungry. The shadows of the sacrificed screamed in unison, their forms flickering, torn between the living world and whatever lay beyond. Whitaker's face, still trapped within the roots, turned toward Evelyn. His expression was no longer twisted in agony. There was something else there now. Relief. With a final violent shudder, the tree collapsed, its trunk imploding as it was consumed by the chasm beneath. The roots that had held Willowbrook together for centuries disintegrated, their purpose undone. Evelyn fell to her knees as the air grew eerily still. The town, what was left of it, stood in stunned silence. The cycle was broken. The curse was lifted. But something else had awakened. A deep, echoing voice whispered through the ruins. "We are free." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She had destroyed the pact. She had freed the trapped souls. But she had also broken the only thing keeping whatever lived beneath the town sealed away. As the first inhuman shapes began to slither out of the shadows, Evelyn realized the truth. Willowbrook wasn't saved. It had only just begun to die. Evelyn's breath came in short gasps as the air around her thickened. The silence that followed the collapse of the cherry tree was more unsettling than the screams that had preceded it. The town, once held together by its dark secret, was crumbling. She rose shakily to her feet, her injured hand throbbing, blood dripping onto the fractured pavement beneath her. The deep whispers that had haunted her since she arrived in Willowbrook had changed. No longer pleading. Now they were laughing. The ground beneath her trembled again, not from collapse, but from something pushing upward. A new sound emerged, a low, resonant clicking that echoed from the darkness of the ruined town square. Evelyn turned sharply, her pulse hammering. The figures emerging from the chasm weren't ghosts. They were something else entirely. From the deep, gaping hole in the earth, twisted forms began to rise. They had no true faces, just elongated, hollowed-out visages, as if their skin had been stretched too thin. Their bodies were tangled with the same blackened roots that had once restrained the town, but now they moved freely, graceful in their grotesqueness. Evelyn took a step back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet refused to move. She had unsealed something that was never meant to be freed. Whitaker's form, what remained of it, still clung to the rotting tree trunk. His hollow eyes flickered with something that might have once been human recognition. His lips moved, no sound emerging, but she understood the words nonetheless. "Run!" A sudden, violent gust of wind howled through the broken streets, whipping through Evelyn's hair. The sky, still thick with swirling clouds, took on an unnatural crimson hue. The town moaned, the buildings shifting, leaning toward the source of the rising creatures. And then she saw it. A shape far taller than the others began to rise from the depths. Its limbs were too long, too many, moving like an arachnid pulling itself from a cocoon. The remains of old sacrifices, faces still frozen in silent screams, were embedded within its twisted body. It didn't walk, it glided, its movements fluid, unnatural. It had been waiting for this. Evelyn stumbled backward, her hands trembling as she clutched the ledger tighter. She had thought breaking the cycle would save the town, but the town had never been the thing that needed saving. The roots had not been a curse. They had been a prison. A new whisper slid against her ear, impossibly close, though there was no one there. "You freed us, Evelyn. Now we will feast." Her stomach turned. She had to get out. She had to. A hand, no, a root, shot from the cracked earth, wrapping around her ankle. The town wasn't letting her go. The grip around Evelyn's ankle tightened, the roots curling like fingers made of bone. She thrashed, panic surging through her veins as she clawed at the pavement, desperate to free herself. The twisted creatures surrounding her watched, their hollow faces stretching into unnatural grins. The whispering voices weren't pleading anymore. They were hungry. She had set them free, and now they were taking what they had been denied for centuries. Evelyn reached into her pocket, fingers slick with blood, and pulled out Whitaker's hunting knife. With one desperate swing, she slashed at the root, severing it. A guttural scream rippled through the air, and the town shuddered in response. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The massive entity, the thing that had been buried beneath Willowbrook for centuries, was fully awake now. It loomed over the ruins, its many limbs unfurling, its grotesque form shifting like a living nightmare. The faces embedded in its flesh moaned, a chorus of the damned. The town wasn't just dying. It was becoming something else. Evelyn had one chance. One final, desperate attempt to stop it before it could spread beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook. She turned to the ledger, flipping to the last page, her name, written in fresh ink. She understood now. She had been the final piece all along. With trembling hands, she raised the bloodied knife. The sacrifice had always required one of Caldwell's bloodline. If she ended it here, if she gave herself willingly, maybe, just maybe, she could destroy the town before it devoured anything else. The creature took a step forward, the ground beneath it caving in, the roots stretching toward her. Evelyn pressed the blade against her palm, ready to make the final cut. Then the wind shifted. The ledger's pages flipped wildly, and suddenly, a new name appeared beneath hers. Whitaker. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. No, he was already gone. He had been swallowed by the roots, by the curse. Unless. Her heart pounded as she looked up at the monstrous form, the faces within its flesh. One of them, at the very center, was Whitaker's. He wasn't gone. He was still fighting. A spark of hope ignited in Evelyn's chest. If he was still inside, still part of it, then maybe there was another way. Maybe she didn't have to die for this. She grabbed the ledger, clutching it tightly, and did the one thing she had feared doing since this nightmare began. She spoke his name. Whitaker. The entity froze. A tremor ran through its limbs, the faces in its flesh twisting, contorting. The wind howled, the buildings groaned, and the roots lashed out violently. The town was collapsing in on itself, consumed by the force that had sustained it for so long. Evelyn didn't stop. Whitaker, listen to me. You don't belong to this town. It doesn't own you. A horrible shrieking sound erupted from the depths of the creature, a mixture of rage and agony. The sky above split open, the darkness beginning to fracture. Evelyn stepped forward, tears burning in her eyes. She knew he could hear her. "You have to let go," she cried. "You have to take it with you." The entity convulsed, its limbs collapsing inward, the roots unraveling from the buildings, from the streets, from the very ground itself. The faces embedded in its flesh began to fade, dissolving into the wind like ashes. And then, Whitaker's voice, faint barely there, but real. "Evelyn." She saw him, for just a moment, at the center of the collapsing form. His eyes locked onto hers. Then, with one final, deafening roar, the entity imploded. The force of it sent Evelyn tumbling backward, shielding her face as a wave of dust and debris surged past her. The air crackled, the scent of cherry blossoms burning away into nothingness. And just like that, Willowbrook was gone. When Evelyn opened her eyes, she was lying on what remained of the road. The town had vanished. There were no buildings, no streets, no cherry trees. Just an empty field, untouched and silent. The curse was broken, but Whitaker was gone. She sat up slowly, her body aching, her heart heavy. The ledger lay beside her, its pages blank. No names, no signatures. The cycle had ended. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, staring into the emptiness where Willowbrook had once stood. She had survived, but some part of her knew she would never be the same again. The grip around Evelyn's ankle tightened, the roots curling like fingers made of bone. She thrashed, panic surging through her veins as she clawed at the pavement, desperate to free herself. The twisted creatures surrounding her watched, their hollow faces stretching into unnatural grins. The whispering voices weren't pleading anymore. They were hungry. She had set them free, and now they were taking what they had been denied for centuries. Evelyn reached into her pocket, fingers slick with blood, and pulled out Whitaker's hunting knife. With one desperate swing, she slashed at the root, severing it. A guttural scream rippled through the air, and the town shuddered in response. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The massive entity, the thing that had been buried beneath Willowbrook for centuries, was fully awake now. It loomed over the ruins, its many limbs unfurling, its grotesque form shifting like a living nightmare. The faces embedded in its flesh moaned, a chorus of the damned. The town wasn't just dying, it was becoming something else. Evelyn had one chance. One final, desperate attempt to stop it before it could spread beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook. She turned to the ledger, flipping to the last page. Her name, written in fresh ink. She understood now. She had been the final piece all along. With trembling hands, she raised the bloodied knife. The sacrifice had always required one of Caldwell's bloodline. If she ended it here, if she gave herself willingly, maybe, just maybe, she could destroy the town before it devoured anything else. The creature took a step forward, the ground beneath it caving in, the roots stretching toward her. Evelyn pressed the blade against her palm, ready to make the final cut. Then the wind shifted. The ledger's pages flipped wildly, and suddenly, a new name appeared beneath hers. Whitaker. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. No, he was already gone. He had been swallowed by the roots, by the curse. Unless. Her heart pounded as she looked up at the monstrous form, the faces within its flesh. One of them, at the very center, was Whitaker's. He wasn't gone. He was still fighting. A spark of hope ignited in Evelyn's chest. If he was still inside, still part of it, then maybe there was another way. Maybe she didn't have to die for this. She grabbed the ledger, clutching it tightly, and did the one thing she had feared doing since this nightmare began. She spoke his name. Whitaker. The entity froze. A tremor ran through its limbs, the faces in its flesh twisting, contorting. The wind howled, the buildings groaned, and the roots lashed out violently. The town was collapsing in on itself, consumed by the force that had sustained it for so long. Evelyn didn't stop. Whitaker, listen to me. You don't belong to this town. It doesn't own you. A horrible shrieking sound erupted from the depths of the creature, a mixture of rage and agony. The sky above split open, the darkness beginning to fracture. Evelyn stepped forward, tears burning in her eyes. She knew he could hear her. You have to let go, she cried. You have to take it with you. The entity convulsed, its limbs collapsing inward, the roots unraveling from the buildings, from the streets, from the very ground itself. The faces embedded in its flesh began to fade, dissolving into the wind like ashes. And then, Whitaker's voice, faint barely there, but real. Evelyn. She saw him for just a moment at the center of the collapsing form. His eyes locked onto hers. Then, with one final deafening roar, the entity imploded. The force of it sent Evelyn tumbling backward, shielding her face as a wave of dust and debris surged past her. The air crackled, the scent of cherry blossoms burning away into nothingness. And just like that, Willowbrook was gone. When Evelyn opened her eyes, she was lying on what remained of the road. The town had vanished. There were no buildings, no streets, no cherry trees. Just an empty field, untouched and silent. The curse was broken, but Whitaker was gone. She sat up slowly, her body aching, her heart heavy. The ledger lay beside her, its pages blank. No names, no signatures. The cycle had ended. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, staring into the emptiness where Willowbrook had once stood. She had survived, but some part of her knew she would never be the same again. The meadow stretched endlessly before Daniel, its rolling hills painted with the fresh greens and yellows of early spring. The house, his grandmother's old farmhouse, stood alone at the edge of the field, its white paint peeling, its windows dark and lifeless. He had spent countless summers here as a child, but now, returning as an adult, the place felt wrong. His grandmother had passed away 2 months ago, leaving him the house and the surrounding acres. He hadn't planned to return, had barely even thought about this place in years, but something about the old property had called to him. Or maybe someone. Daniel stepped out of his car, the cool spring air brushing against his face. The scent of wildflowers mixed with damp earth, filling his lungs with something both nostalgic and unsettling. The wind carried a soft rustling sound across the grass, but the trees at the property's edge stood perfectly still. As he made his way up the front steps, he caught something out of the corner of his eye, a figure standing in the middle of the meadow. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a person. Not really. It was too still, too thin, almost like a scarecrow, but wrong. It had no outstretched arms, no tattered clothing blowing in the wind. Just a tall, shadowy form, its head tilted slightly as if watching him. A trick of the light, Daniel told himself. A tree stump, a forgotten fence post. He forced himself to look away and stepped into the house, leaving the meadow behind him. But as he locked the door and let the silence settle around him, one thought lingered at the back of his mind. The figure had been closer than he remembered, and it hadn't been there when he arrived. Daniel awoke with a start, his breath ragged, his body slick with sweat. The dream had been too real. The figure from the meadow, closer than before, its shadow stretching unnaturally long under the pale light of the moon. But the moment he sat up, the details of the nightmare fled, dissolving into the quiet stillness of the house. He ran a hand through his hair, shaking off the unease. It was just a dream, nothing more. But when he glanced at the clock, 3:12 a.m., a cold realization settled in his stomach. Something had woken him up. A sound. He held his breath, listening. At first, there was nothing but the usual creaks of an old house settling in the night. But then, crunch. His heart froze. It had come from outside. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on gravel. Right outside his window. Daniel swung his legs over the edge of the bed, moving slowly, carefully, trying to keep his breathing steady. He reached for the flashlight on his nightstand, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. Crunch! The sound came again. Closer. He forced himself to stand, inching toward the window. The wooden floor beneath him groaned softly, but he barely noticed. His pulse was pounding, his ears straining for any other sound. Finally, he reached the window and pulled back the curtain. The meadow stretched before him, bathed in silver moonlight. The tall grass swayed gently in the wind. The house's front yard was empty. But something wasn't right. The figure was back. Closer now. Standing at the edge of the yard, Daniel sucked in a sharp breath. He could see it more clearly this time. A tall, gaunt shape, its form obscured by the shadows, yet somehow too solid to be a trick of the eye. It stood perfectly still, facing the house, its head slightly tilted, like it was studying him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, the figure took one step forward. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Another step. The flashlight in his grip flickered, the beam of light trembling against the glass. His instincts screamed at him to move, to run, to do anything but stand frozen in place. But his body wouldn't listen. He could only watch as the figure took another deliberate, agonizingly slow step forward. It was coming for him. No, he thought, shaking his head, forcing himself to break free of the trance. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Then he blinked, and the figure was gone. The meadow stood empty once more, its silence heavier than before. Daniel staggered back from the window, his breath shaky, his mind racing. His first instinct was to grab his phone, but when he looked down at it, there was no signal. No Wi-Fi. Nothing. Something wanted him isolated. The old farmhouse creaked, a slow, aching sound, as if the very walls could feel his fear. He glanced around the dimly lit room, suddenly aware of how alone he was out here. He needed to leave. Morning. He'd wait for morning, and then he'd be gone. But as Daniel settled back into bed, pulling the covers tight around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere out there in the meadow, the figure was still watching. And next time, it wouldn't stop at the edge of the yard. Daniel barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure, standing just beyond the edge of the meadow, closer each time, its elongated form stretching unnaturally against the moonlight. The house groaned in the wind, the walls seeming thinner than he remembered, as if the very structure knew it couldn't keep him safe. By the time morning arrived, the exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. He forced himself out of bed, every nerve in his body screaming at him to leave now. But before he packed his things, he had to be sure. Daniel moved to the window, gripping the curtain between his fingers, dreading what he might see. The meadow was empty. His breath came out in a shudder. No footprints in the dewy grass. No trace of anything lurking in the night. Maybe it had been his imagination. Maybe his mind had played tricks on him, twisting shadows into monsters. Maybe. Tap, tap, tap. Daniel's entire body froze. The sound hadn't come from the window in front of him. It came from the window behind him. His movements were slow, mechanical, as he turned his head. The bedroom had another window facing the back of the house, one he hadn't looked at yet. His heart pounded, his stomach twisted. He didn't want to see it. He didn't want to know. But his eyes moved to the glass anyway. And it was there, standing just outside the back window, closer than ever. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The figure was still faceless, its shape wrong, too tall, too thin. Its head tilted, the same unnatural motion as before. But now there was something different. It had arms, not hanging at its sides, pressed against the glass. Its fingers long, bony, too many joints splayed wide, the tips of them tapping the window in slow, deliberate motions. Tap, tap, tap. Daniel stumbled backward, crashing into the nightstand. The lamp fell, the bulb shattering on impact, but he barely noticed. His pulse thundered in his ears, his breathing ragged. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't move. The figure's head twitched. Then it moved. Not away, not disappearing into the meadow like before. It crawled up the side of the house. Daniel's stomach lurched as he watched the impossible happen. The figure's limbs bent in ways they shouldn't, gripping the wooden frame of the house with those horrific hands, pulling itself upward, slow and deliberate, its faceless head never breaking eye contact. It was going to the roof. Daniel snapped out of his paralysis. He had to get out. Now. Heart hammering, he grabbed his keys from the dresser and bolted for the door. His feet barely touched the stairs as he raced down them, skipping steps, nearly falling. He needed to get to his car. He needed to leave this place and never look back. He reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. His hands were shaking too much. Come on, come on. Then the creaking started. Above him. Slow. Steady. Footsteps. It was inside. A strangled gasp tore from his throat as he threw the door open and sprinted outside. The morning air hit him like a slap, but he didn't stop. He ran to his car, yanked the door open, and threw himself inside, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. For the first time since he arrived, relief flooded his chest. He had made it. He was getting out. But then, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. The back seat. Daniel turned his head, dread pooling in his stomach. The figure was sitting right behind him, and this time it had a mouth, and it was smiling. Daniel's scream never made it past his lips. His throat closed, his entire body frozen as his mind refused to process the horror behind him. The figure in the back seat was smiling. Its face, which had been nothing but shifting shadows before, had solidified into something worse, a grotesque, stretched version of his own features. The mouth, too wide, curled at the corners, revealing rows of too many teeth. Its hollow eyes reflected his own terror, empty and endless. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The air inside the car felt heavy, suffocating, pressing in on his chest like an unbearable weight. Then it spoke. "You see me now." The voice was his own. Distorted. Wrong. As if the words were being forced through a throat filled with gravel and static. Daniel snapped. His survival instinct overpowered his paralysis, and he lunged for the door handle. His fingers barely brushed it when a cold, clawed hand gripped his wrist. It wasn't strong, but its touch sent an icy wave of sickness through his veins. His vision blurred, black spots creeping at the edges. The world around him warped, the air filling with the overpowering scent of damp earth and wildflowers rotting in the sun. "You see me now," it repeated, voice closer, as if it were breathing against his ear. Daniel jerked his arm free, throwing himself out of the car and onto the gravel driveway. His knees scraped against the jagged stones, but he barely felt the pain. He scrambled backward, gasping for breath, his pulse pounding like a war drum. The car was empty. The back seat was bare. The driver's seat untouched. The keys still in the ignition, the engine purring softly. Daniel's eyes darted to the house. The front door was wide open, swaying gently in the morning breeze. It was inside. He wanted to run, get in the car and speed away. But his body wouldn't move. His instincts screamed that it wouldn't matter. No matter how far he ran, how fast he drove, it would be there. A rustling sound made him whip his head toward the meadow. The figure stood at the edge of the grass, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle. Watching, waiting. Daniel forced himself to his feet, legs shaking beneath him. He had to do something. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep pretending this wasn't happening. He needed answers. He needed to know what it wanted. And there was only one place to find them: his grandmother's study. He turned toward the house, heart pounding, knowing that stepping back inside would be the worst decision of his life. But he had no other choice. The thing in the meadow wasn't going anywhere. Daniel's breath was uneven as he stepped through the front door. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of old wood settling under his weight. The scent of dust and age filled his nose, but beneath it lingered something sour, something rotting. His grandmother's study was at the end of the hall, past the living room where the faded armchairs still faced an ancient fireplace. He remembered sitting in them as a child, listening to her stories, tales of spirits that lingered in the land, of warnings carved into trees long before roads were paved. Now those stories felt too real. He reached the study door, his fingers trembling as he grasped the handle. It turned easily, swinging open with a soft groan. The room was just as he remembered. Shelves filled with old books, a desk cluttered with papers, a large window overlooking the meadow. Except something was different. The window was open. Daniel's stomach twisted. He hadn't left it open. He hadn't even been in here yet. A gust of wind sent a stack of papers fluttering to the floor. He bent down, gathering them up, until his hands froze on a photograph. It was old, yellowed at the edges. A black and white image of the house, taken decades ago. His grandmother stood in front of it, smiling. And just beyond her, in the meadow, a figure stood in the tall grass. The same figure that had been watching him. Daniel's hands shook as he flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in his grandmother's familiar handwriting were 5 words. "Do not look too long." A chill ran down his spine. She had known. She had seen it too. The wind picked up, rattling the window frame. Daniel turned his head toward the glass, dreading what he might see outside. The meadow stretched before him, the wildflowers swaying in the breeze. And at the very edge, closer than ever, the figure stood. Waiting. Watching. His grandmother had left him this house, but she had also left him something else. Something buried beneath the years of silence and unspoken warnings. And now it wanted him to remember. It wanted him to see. Daniel's fingers tightened around the photograph, his grandmother's warning echoing in his head. Do not look too long. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy. The figure in the meadow had been there for decades, maybe longer, watching, waiting. But for what? He needed answers. The study was filled with his grandmother's notes, letters, journals, scraps of paper covered in frantic handwriting. He swept them off the desk, spreading them out across the floor, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. The words blurred in his vision as he skimmed through them. It does not age. It does not move when you watch. But it gets closer when you forget. Daniel's heart pounded. His grandmother had known about it her entire life. Had she been running from it? Had she, too, felt its presence, creeping closer whenever her mind drifted? Then something else caught his eye, a leather-bound journal, tucked at the bottom of the pile. He flipped it open, scanning the faded ink. Spring, 1962. I saw it for the first time today. I was picking flowers in the meadow when I felt something off, a stillness that didn't belong. I turned, and there it was. Tall, wrong, watching. I told my mother, but she just shook her head. Don't look too long, she said. Don't give it your time. But it's always there. I can feel it, even when I close my eyes. Daniel turned the page. More entries, each one detailing sightings, warnings, desperate instructions. Then one stood out. Spring 1979. I tried to leave today. Packed my bags. Got in the car. I didn't even make it to the road before the engine died. I stepped outside to check the battery, and it was waiting in the driveway. It won't let me go. Daniel's stomach twisted. He scrambled back, knocking over a chair. It won't let me go. He looked toward the open window. The meadow stretched before him, golden and swaying, deceptively peaceful. And the figure? Closer. A shudder ran through him. He had spent the night in the house, barely looking outside, barely thinking about it. And in that time it had moved. It had been waiting for him to forget. Daniel's mind reeled. He needed to leave. Now! He grabbed his keys and ran for the door, but just as his fingers brushed the handle, a voice. Soft. Almost familiar. Daniel. He froze. The voice came from behind him, from inside the house. But he was alone. He turned, his pulse hammering. The study was dim, the papers on the floor shifting slightly in the breeze from the window. Then the floor creaked. A shadow moved in the hallway. The front door suddenly felt impossibly far away. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps as the air thickened, the walls seeming to close in around him. He backed up slowly, his legs weak beneath him, his ears straining for any sound beyond the rhythmic pounding of his heart. Another whisper. Daniel! It was closer this time. His fingers fumbled for something, anything, to use as a weapon. His hand landed on a rusted fireplace poker leaning against the hearth. He gripped it tightly, raising it in front of him as he took another step backward. Then he saw it. The shadow in the hallway wasn't a trick of the light. It was standing there, just at the edge of the dim glow from the study. Tall, silent, waiting. Daniel's grip on the poker tightened. His body screamed at him to run, to get out of the house. But deep down, he already knew. The front door wouldn't open. The truck wouldn't start. Because it wasn't done with him yet. Because it was always watching. Because it had finally stepped inside. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as he locked eyes with the shadow in the hallway. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It only stood there, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its presence stretching the air tight around him. His grip on the fireplace poker tightened, his knuckles white. The silence pressed against his eardrums, thick and unbearable. Then, the light flickered. For a split second, the hallway went completely dark. And when the light came back, it was closer. Daniel staggered backward, his heartbeat slamming against his ribs. The figure had moved, but it hadn't walked. It hadn't made a single sound. It just shifted. A whisper crawled through the air. Not from the hallway. Not from outside. It came from inside his own head. You can't leave. Daniel's vision blurred as his body screamed at him to run. But where? The front door? Blocked. The back door? Too far. The windows? He had seen what was out there. It was in here now. The study. The only place he could think to go. Summoning every ounce of willpower, he bolted for the room, his feet barely touching the floor as he slammed the door shut behind him. His hands shook as he locked it, stepping back, his chest heaving. Silence. Then, tap, tap, tap. Daniel's entire body locked up. The sound was coming from the other side of the door. Soft, slow, measured. It wasn't knocking. It was mimicking. His blood ran cold. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the poker so tightly it cut into his palm. He couldn't let it in. He couldn't let it in. The tapping stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something new, a sound that made his stomach drop. Scratching. Not at the door. Above him. Daniel's eyes shot upward. The ceiling groaned under a sudden weight, dust sifting down in lazy spirals. His mind raced. It was on the ceiling. Then the whisper again, too close now, too deep inside him. Why do you run? His body moved before his mind could. He lunged for the bookshelf, grabbing the leather journal, the one filled with his grandmother's warnings for desperate notes. There had to be something in here, something to tell him what this was. A sudden thud above him. Daniel bit back a scream. Another thud. Then another. Faster now. It wasn't just moving on the ceiling. It was crawling toward the vent. Panic flooded his veins as he flipped through the brittle pages, desperate, frantic. His grandmother had survived with this thing watching her for decades. How? There had to be something. And then he saw it. A single line, scrawled at the bottom of a page. The ink smudged as if written in trembling hands. It can only take what you give it. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His mind reeled. He had been running, hiding, giving it his fear, his time, his thoughts. He was feeding it. The thudding above him stopped. A new kind of silence fell over the room. A silence full of anticipation. Slowly, as if sensing his realization, a voice slithered through the walls, curling in his ears. Look at me. Daniel clenched his jaw, his nails digging into his palm. No. Look at me, Daniel. No. His body trembled, every instinct screaming at him to glance up, to acknowledge it, to see it. But he wouldn't. He wouldn't give it anything else. The air grew thicker, heavier, the temperature in the room dropping as the unseen thing pressed against the walls, the ceiling, the door waiting. Then just as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. The weight above him vanished. The whispering faded. The air lightened, as if whatever had been there had simply lost interest. Daniel stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, his breath still coming in uneven gasps. He slowly, so slowly, lowered the poker, listening. Nothing. The house was silent again. Had he done it? Had he starved it? Daniel's fingers trembled as he lifted the journal again, staring at the final line of his grandmother's entry. Do not look. Do not listen. And above all, do not let it in. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his pulse finally slowing. Then, from outside the window, a familiar shape, standing in the meadow. But further away now. For the first time, it had moved backward. Daniel exhaled, his body sagging with exhaustion. He wasn't safe, not yet. But now, he had something he didn't have before. A way to fight back. Daniel didn't move for a long time. He kept his gaze fixed on the figure in the meadow, its silhouette barely visible in the early morning mist. It had moved back. He wasn't sure how long he had been gripping the journal, but his knuckles ached, his fingers stiff from how tightly he had been clutching it. The words repeated in his mind over and over. It can only take what you give it. If that was true, then his fear had been feeding it. His attention had been making it stronger. And now, for the first time, it had retreated. Daniel inhaled shakily and let the breath out in a slow, measured exhale. His mind was still spinning, his pulse still erratic, but for the first time since arriving at the house, he had control. He had to keep that control. With effort, he pulled himself away from the window. His body felt too light, like he had been drained of something, but he refused to give in to the exhaustion. He needed to test this, to see if ignoring it would really push it further away. First, though, he needed coffee. The kitchen was silent, save for the slow drip of the coffee machine. Daniel sat at the worn wooden table, rubbing his temples. The journal lay open beside him, and he forced himself to read through the notes again. The entries grew more frantic as the years went on. I made the mistake of staring too long today. It's closer now. I dreamed about it last night. When I woke up, my bedroom window was open. The day I turned 50, I tried to leave. I only made it halfway down the driveway before the car stalled. It stood at the gate, waiting. It knows I can't go. Daniel swallowed hard. His grandmother had lived with this thing for decades. If she had figured out how to survive, why hadn't she left? Why stay in a house she knew was cursed? Unless a new thought crept into his mind, something dark and unwelcome. What if she wasn't just surviving? What if she had been keeping it here? Daniel pushed the thought away and stood up, stretching his aching muscles. He glanced toward the front door. His keys were still there. He had to try. The truck rumbled to life beneath him. And for the first time since arriving, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, trying to keep his mind from spiraling. Maybe it really was just fear. Maybe if he ignored it, if he stopped feeding it, it would lose its hold on this place. He put the truck into gear, easing it forward. The gravel under the tires crunched as he pulled onto the driveway. The early morning light painted the landscape in soft, golden hues, and for a moment he felt almost normal. Then he saw it. The figure stood at the edge of the meadow, still and silent, but something was wrong. It wasn't just watching. It was waiting. Daniel gritted his teeth and forced himself to look away. Don't acknowledge it. Don't feed it. He pressed harder on the gas, determined to get past it. The truck stalled. His stomach dropped. Daniel twisted the key, but the engine only clicked. He stole a glance in the rearview mirror. His breath caught in his throat. The figure was no longer at the edge of the meadow. It was standing in the middle of the road. Daniel's heart pounded as he slammed his hand against the steering wheel. No, he wasn't going to let it pull him into this. He refused to give in. He closed his eyes, counted to 5, and exhaled. When he opened them, the road was empty. The truck roared back to life. Daniel didn't hesitate. He hit the gas, tires kicking up dirt as he sped away from the house. He had made it, but as he glanced into the mirror one last time, dread crawled up his spine. The meadow was empty, and somehow that felt worse. Daniel didn't stop driving until the house was miles behind him. The tension in his chest didn't ease, even as the fields turned to forests and the dirt roads turned to asphalt. He kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it standing in the middle of the road, waiting. But the road stayed empty. For the first time in days, Daniel allowed himself to believe he was free. His hands ached from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. He exhaled and forced his shoulders to relax. He needed to keep moving. The closest town was still a good hour away, and the last thing he wanted was for night to fall before he reached it. He switched on the radio, hoping for some background noise, but only static filled the speakers. With a sigh, he reached to turn it off. A whisper crackled through the static. Daniel's hand froze. It was faint, almost lost in the white noise, but it was there. Daniel! His breath caught in his throat. It was his own voice. The static surged, and the whisper grew clearer, stronger. Daniel, you never left. A cold wave of dread washed over him. He turned off the radio, his heart hammering against his ribs. No, this wasn't happening. He had left. He had escaped. But the road ahead didn't look right. His fingers tightened around the wheel. When had the trees gotten so dense? The sun was still up, but the light seemed wrong. Dimmer. Fading. Daniel swallowed hard and pressed the gas pedal. The truck roared forward, but the scenery remained unchanged. The same trees. The same bends in the road. A sharp realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He was driving in a circle. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, knuckles turning white. He slammed on the brakes and threw the truck into park, breathing heavily. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. He stepped out of the truck, the cool air hitting his face. The road was silent. Empty. Too empty. No birds. No wind. No sound at all. Then he saw them. Footprints, leading from the edge of the trees, coming toward the truck. Daniel's stomach turned. They weren't there a minute ago. Slowly, he followed them with his eyes, heart hammering in his chest. The last footprint was right behind him. A shadow stretched over his own. A breath, not his, brushed against his ear. You never left. Daniel spun around. The road was empty. But the truck, the driver's side door was open. And something, was sitting in the driver's seat. Watching him. Waiting. Daniel's breath hitched as he stared at the figure in the driver's seat. It was facing forward, hands resting on the steering wheel, as if it had always been there. But it wasn't him. It looked like him. Same hair, same jacket, same posture. But the way its fingers twitched against the leather, too mechanical, too unnatural, sent a fresh wave of dread down his spine. Daniel took a slow, deliberate step back. The thing in the truck didn't move. It just waited. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he debated his next move. If he ran, would it chase him? If he tried to take the truck back, what would it do? Then, without warning, it turned its head. The motion was slow, deliberate, like a puppet being guided by unseen strings. Its eyes locked onto him, his own eyes staring back at him. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The thing smiled. Not a natural expression, not something human. It stretched too wide. the corners of its lips pulling far beyond what should have been possible. The teeth weren't quite right, too straight, too uniform, like something trying to mimic him and failing. It raised one hand from the wheel and curled its fingers in a slow, deliberate beckoning motion. "Get in." Daniel shook his head, stepping further away. "No," he whispered, voice shaking. "I'm not playing your game." The thing tilted its head, the exact same way the figure in the meadow had before. The connection slammed into Daniel like a freight train. It was never just in the meadow. It had been waiting, following. The figure in the truck suddenly lurched forward, the engine roaring to life. The headlights blazed against the darkness, casting long, twisting shadows along the trees. Daniel turned on his heel and ran. The tires screeched behind him. Gravel kicked up as the truck spun around, its engine growling like a predator taking chase. Daniel sprinted into the trees, branches slashing at his arms as he dove deeper into the forest. The roar of the truck's engine faded, but he didn't stop running. Not until he was sure it was gone. His lungs burned. His legs ached. But he had no choice. He couldn't stop now. Then, silence. The truck was gone. Daniel slowed, gasping for air. The trees around him stood tall and silent, the night pressing in like a heavy weight. His body trembled, his mind spinning with the impossible reality of what had just happened. Then he heard it. Crunch. A single footstep. Right behind him. He turned, pulse hammering. The truck wasn't there, but the figure was. It stood just beyond the tree line, closer than ever. Daniel's vision swam. The smile hadn't left its face, and in its hand, dangling from its fingers, were his car keys. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. His car keys dangled from the figure's fingers, swinging gently like a pendulum, as if taunting him. The twisted version of himself stood motionless at the tree line, its too wide smile never faltering. Daniel took a step back, then another. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. It was too close now, too real, too much like him. A voice, his own voice, but wrong, whispered through the trees. "You never left." Daniel's stomach twisted. He had left. He had driven away. He had seen the road stretch for miles behind him. Hadn't he? A deep, sickening feeling crawled up his spine. He looked around, desperate to find something that made sense. But the trees around him were too familiar, too still. The forest wasn't vast like he'd thought. It was closing in. Then the figure moved. Not in a normal way. It didn't walk. It shifted, flickering forward in jerking, unnatural motions. 1 second standing at the tree line, the next directly in front of him. Daniel recoiled, stumbling backward. The figure raised its arm, holding out the keys. "Take them," it said in his voice. Perfectly his voice. Daniel's mouth went dry. "No." The thing's smile widened, stretching inhumanly, as if its skin weren't made to hold expressions. "Then stay." The words weren't a threat. They were a fact. Daniel's breath hitched. The journal, his grandmother's notes, had warned him. It can only take what you give it. And he had been giving it everything, his attention, his fear, his belief that it was real. He clenched his fists. He had to break free. He had to take control. Slowly, deliberately, he forced himself to turn his back on it. The moment he did, the forest shifted again. The air thickened, pressing against him like unseen hands. The figure whispered his name, over and over, trying to pull him back. But he didn't turn around. He walked forward. 1 step. Another. The pressure grew. Then, suddenly, a rush of cold air. The weight lifted. The whispers stopped. Daniel opened his eyes. The truck was there. The real truck, parked exactly where he had left it. The keys were in his hand. The meadow behind him was empty. Daniel didn't question it. He didn't waste a second. He got in the truck, started the engine, and drove. He didn't look back, because he knew, if he did, the meadow wouldn't be empty anymore. Daniel drove without stopping, his fingers gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The road stretched ahead, empty, endless. His heart was still hammering in his chest, but he refused to look in the rearview mirror. Not even once. The radio crackled softly, but he kept it off. He didn't trust the silence. Didn't trust that he had truly escaped. His grandmother's warnings looped in his mind. Do not look too long. Do not give it your time. Do not let it in. The further he drove, the more his thoughts tangled. Had it really let him go? Or was it just waiting? A deep unease settled in his bones. He knew somehow that it wasn't gone, just out of sight. An hour passed. Then two. Finally, he reached a small roadside diner, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. The sight of something normal made his breath hitch with relief. He pulled into the parking lot and sat in the truck, his body trembling as the adrenaline faded. He needed food. Coffee. Anything to ground him back in reality. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The warm scent of coffee and bacon filled the air. A waitress, middle-aged, tired eyes, gave him a polite nod. "Long drive?" she asked. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." She poured him a cup of coffee without asking, setting it down in front of him. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel let out a shaky laugh. Something like that. The diner was nearly empty. A trucker sat in the corner booth, scrolling through his phone. An older man near the jukebox stirred his tea, staring into nothing. Daniel sipped the coffee, the warmth settling his nerves. This was real. The diner, the coffee, the people. He had made it out. But then, the bell above the door jingled again. Daniel's stomach twisted. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. The hairs on the back of his neck rose. He kept his eyes on the coffee, refusing to look up. A shadow passed over his table. A whisper just above his ear. "You look back." His blood froze. The diner around him shifted, the colors bleeding into something darker, something colder. The air thickened, pressing against his chest. The clatter of plates and the hum of conversation faded. He forced himself to raise his head. The diner was empty. Outside the window, the meadow stretched endlessly. And in the middle of it, it stood smiling. Daniel's scream never left his throat. Daniel's body locked up. His breath hitched as he stared at the window, at the endless meadow that shouldn't be there. The air inside the diner had turned thick, suffocating. The lights above flickered, buzzing like distant static. The figure in the meadow didn't move, but its presence swelled, filling the space between them, pressing against Daniel's chest like unseen hands. This isn't real. This isn't real. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the edges of the table until his knuckles turned white. The coffee cup in front of him was still warm. He could feel the smooth ceramic beneath his fingertips. He had just been here, hadn't he? A soft sound like a whisper of fabric brushing against itself. Daniel's eyes snapped open. The figure was closer. It stood just beyond the diner window now, its head tilted in that unnatural way, its too wide smile stretching impossibly far. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He needed to move. He needed to break this loop, to find something real, something that would tether him to the world outside of this nightmare. Slowly, shakily, he pushed back his chair. The wooden legs scraped against the linoleum floor, the sound deafening in the eerie silence. The bell above the door hadn't rung again. No one else had entered or left. That meant he wasn't alone. A sharp, cold breath brushed against his ear. "Sit back down, Daniel." The voice was his own. Daniel whipped around, his heart slamming against his ribs. No one was there. The trucker was gone. The older man with the tea, the waitress, all gone. The diner was abandoned, frozen in time. His coffee still steamed, the scent thick and cloying, but there were no other sounds. No kitchen noises, no radio playing faintly in the background. Just him, and the thing wearing his voice. His fingers twitched, desperate for something to hold on to, something solid. The journal, the rules his grandmother had written. Do not let it in. His heartbeat pounded in his skull. He knew, deep in his gut, that he had already made a mistake. He had looked back, and now it was inside. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of the silence pressed down on him. The diner was frozen, trapped in a moment that wasn't real, the air thick with something unseen, something watching. The figure in the meadow hadn't moved, but Daniel could feel it. Inside, it wasn't standing beyond the glass anymore. It was here, in the walls, in the floor, in his own mind. Do not let it in. But it was already too late. A sound, a sharp, rhythmic tapping, echoed through the diner. It came from the window. Daniel turned his head slowly, dreading what he might see. His own reflection stared back at him. Except it wasn't him. Not really. The thing behind the glass smiled, head tilted, eyes dark and endless. Its lips moved, but the words were inside his head, not spoken aloud. "Stay!" Daniel recoiled, his back slamming into the counter. The coffee cup on the table tipped over, spilling dark liquid across the surface, seeping into the cracks of reality itself. The diner seemed to breathe, the walls pulsing, the fluorescent lights humming like distant whispers. I can't let it take me. He forced himself to move, his limbs stiff, the weight of the thing's presence making every step feel wrong. He reached for the door, his fingers trembling as he gripped the handle. The bell did not ring. Cold, static-filled silence wrapped around him like an unseen force, holding him in place. Then the voice came again. You already belong here. Daniel's vision blurred. His grip on the handle tightened, the metal burning cold beneath his palm. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. And then, he saw the other door. It was there, behind the counter, just beyond the kitchen entrance. A door that hadn't been there before. It pulsed faintly, as if waiting for him to notice. A choice. The front door, the obvious way out, was wrong. It would only lead him back, trapping him in the loop again. But the other door? It was unknown, dangerous, but real. The tapping on the glass grew more urgent. The reflection was pressing its hand against the window now, its too wide smile stretching, warping. Daniel took a shuddering breath. And then, without looking back, he ran for the other door. The walls shuddered. The air ripped apart. And as Daniel threw himself through the doorway, the world behind him collapsed into nothing. Daniel hit the ground hard. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening boom. And then, silence. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as he pushed himself up, his palms scraped raw against the cold, wooden floor beneath him. His surroundings had changed. The diner was gone. So was the meadow. He was inside a house. A house that looked exactly like his grandmother's. But something was off. The air smelled stale, like dust and time left undisturbed. The walls were lined with old photographs, his grandmother's, his mother's, even some of himself as a child. But in each one, the eyes of the people were wrong. Faded. Empty. Daniel swallowed hard and took a cautious step forward. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath his weight, the sound too loud in the suffocating silence. He had come through the other door, the one that shouldn't have existed. And now he was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. He reached out and touched the wall. Solid. Real. But this place felt like a memory, something between the past and the present, between his world and something else. A shiver ran down his spine. He had to find a way out. He stepped into the hallway, his pulse quickening with every shadow that stretched too long, every flickering light that buzzed overhead. The house was alive in a way it shouldn't be, like it was waiting. Then he heard it, a whisper, soft, familiar. Daniel! He turned sharply. The voice had come from the living room. His breath caught in his throat as he took slow, deliberate steps toward the sound. The door to the room was slightly ajar, revealing the faint glow of a lamp inside. The air grew colder with each step he took. He reached the doorway and hesitated, his fingers grazing the edge of the frame. Do not let it in. Daniel clenched his jaw and stepped inside. The room was exactly as he remembered it. His grandmother's old armchair, the fireplace, the faded floral wallpaper. But sitting in the chair, facing away from him, was a figure. His heart slammed against his ribs. He didn't need to see the face to know who it was. Grandma! The figure's head tilted slightly. Daniel felt his stomach churn. Something was wrong. The air shifted. And then, the figure stood up. A slow, creaking motion. Unnatural. Too tall. And as it turned toward him, the shadows in the room seemed to bend, swallowing the corners of reality itself. Daniel couldn't breathe, because the thing looking at him wasn't his grandmother. Daniel's entire body locked up as the figure turned to face him. It wore his grandmother's face, but it wasn't her. The features were wrong, stretched too thin, the eyes too large and black, swallowing all the light in the dimly lit room. The mouth curled into a smile, too wide, too knowing. Daniel, it whispered, voice soft, almost loving. You came back. His breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. Every part of his mind screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to move. The air in the room had thickened, pressing against his chest, holding him in place. The thing took a step forward. Daniel took a step back. Its smile widened. Don't be afraid. His fingers curled into fists. Do not let it in. Do not let it in. His grandmother's warnings pounded in his head. But it was already inside, wasn't it? Inside the house. Inside his mind. The floorboards groaned as the thing took another step. You never really left, it murmured, its voice shifting, distorting, a perfect mimicry of his own. You belong here, Daniel. His back hit the wall. No more room to retreat. His fingers fumbled against the wooden surface, searching for anything, a weapon, an escape, something real. Then his hand touched the journal. His grandmother's words. Her warnings. The truth she had left behind for him. The thing's expression twitched, its smile faltering for the first time. Its eyes flicked to the book, recognition, hesitation. Daniel felt the shift. He had power. His breath steadied. Slowly, he opened the journal, flipping through the pages until he found it. The last entry, scrawled in hurried, frantic handwriting. It is not real unless you make it real. His heart pounded. That was the answer. It only had power if he gave it power. It could only take what he gave it. Daniel lifted his gaze. The thing had stopped moving. "I don't believe in you," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The shadows lurched. The thing's smile twitched again, its expression flickering between anger and something else, fear. Daniel stepped forward. "You aren't real." The walls shook. The air rippled. The thing's face, his grandmother's face, began to crack. The skin splintered like porcelain, fractures running from its eyes to its mouth. It screamed, the sound piercing, unnatural. Daniel squeezed the book tighter. "You're just a story," he whispered. The room collapsed. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, everything shattered, folding inward, dragging the thing into the void behind it. Its shrieks echoed as its form distorted, stretching, breaking apart into nothingness. Then, silence. Daniel opened his eyes. He was outside. The house was gone. The meadow stretched before him, golden under the setting sun. Empty. His breath shook as he slowly got to his feet, the journal still clutched in his hands. He had won, but deep inside he knew. The watcher in the meadow would always be waiting, and it would always be looking for someone new to see it.